welcome on behalf of Brookings India to the launch of our electricity and carbon tracker. I'm Rahul Tongia, scholar, and I'm interested in all things energy, and you'll see snippets of something very important. Is there a clicker? Or next slide. And so this is actually a very interesting session where we have several things going on all at once, and we have an excellent panel really bringing some of these issues all together. But if you could please advance the slide. Sorry? Oh, you have to turn these on, yes. So a lot of the discussion in energy has been this phrase transition, and most analyses have looked at energy or kilowatt hours. And for the first time, we are able to go look at not just energy kilowatt hours, but kilowatts, which is the real challenge going forward. And so this is something that's well recognized by scholars, by planners, by government officials. And so this is the first public attempt at putting all of this together. And so this is the website, carbontracker.in. So everyone is now free to go to this website, play with it, get some insights, have conversations. We can discuss more underlying data as well. And so this is now the first public availability of this. Now the name Carbon Tracker is very carbon-centric. So this is actually electricity and carbon tracker, but we realize no one wants to type such a long keyword. So we do not yet have full carbon into this. We don't do industrial carbon emissions. This is electricity carbon emissions, but those are still a very large fraction of India's total carbon emissions. So the agenda today is introduce the demo, and demo the tracker. My colleagues Utkarsh Dalal and Tabish Pare are my co-conspirators in this effort. We have a discussion paper that is available on our website with insights and findings. We'll share only a few highlights from this. What does it mean to go beyond daily numbers to real-time numbers? What did you learn? Then we've also launched this new report, which is also on our website, which answers this very critical question that we are a country of 350 plus gigawatts of installed capacity, but the maximum load met has been in the order of 180, 182. So does this mean we have huge surplus? Is that the standard asset problem or non-performing asset problem? It's more complicated than that, and so this report really helps us understand that issue. And then, of course, we have a fantastic panel discussion with experts and actual decision makers from CEA, MOP, and from Terry. And so, given all that we want to cover, I think we'll get done by 8 p.m. No, no, we will actually keep it brief, hopefully keep it focused, and request to all the audience members as we open it up to discussions, let's keep it short and pointed so we can have more discussion as well. Next slide, please. So I now request my colleague Utkarsh to demo the tracker. So this is the experience and some insights when you go to just carbontracker.in. Utkarsh, over to you. Do we have a handheld mic?
I can use this one.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, hi everyone. So I'm just going to walk through the actual tracker. So when you log on to the web page, this is what you'll see. So this is the generation over the past week. So whatever week you're in, it'll show you that generation. And it shows you the generation by source over time. So for example, over here, the gray patch is thermal generation, the light blue is hydro, dark blue is gas, red is nuclear, and yellow is renewable. At the very top also we have demand met. So that's the total demand of the country at whatever time it is.
And these are 5-minute resolutions.
Yes, it's at a 5-minute interval level. And at the bottom, we also have the corresponding CO2 emissions. So we have total CO2 emissions over 5 minutes in green. And then in purple, we have the CO2 intensity. So we can also say we want to zoom in to just one day rather than seeing this whole week. We can just kind of click and drag, and it'll zoom in. And this moves as well when we zoom in. So the bottom plot is always corresponding to the top plot, and if we want to go back, we can always use the auto scale or also reset axes. They do the same thing. We can zoom this way as well. And then once we have actually zoomed in, we can also nicely pan and just look over a day. So say we're starting on the 27th, we can go left to right and see both of these charts moving. One other interesting thing is that we can just give me a second, reset axes. We can also see we can turn off some of these areas on the chart. So we can say we don't want to see renewable generation. We want to see what the duck curve looks like, right? So we can just click on this and renewable generation will go off, but everything else remains. We can also turn off, say, demand met. And now say we want to put them back, and we also want to see additional things which are not displayed by default. For example, the daily high or the daily low, which is over a 24-hour daily period. So we can see these two as well. So you can see the gap, and over a longer range, you can see that gap change. So let's move on to one of the next tabs that we have, which has some of the other features of the tracker. Yes, sorry. So to get to, say, well, let's look at this one. This is weekly moving averages. So to get to here, we go up here and we click on this pull down, and by default it's showing corrected generation data. We just have to go down and click on weekly moving averages and set the range. So you can set either a range, or you can look at a specific week or a month. So the raw data has a bunch of errors in it. So random spikes, things like that. So it's just some small corrections that we have done to make it more consistent. So here we're looking at the weekly moving averages from November, which is when we first started getting this data, to today. We can see how these have changed. So this one at the top is demand met, the one at the bottom is thermal generation. So the moving average of thermal generation seems to actually be going down, whereas this one has not gone down as much. If we look at some of the other moving averages, such as renewable and hydro, we see that these have also started going up, sometime in April onwards. So from this we can tell that these are the ones that are making up the increase in demand rather than thermal. So let's move on to the next tab, which is the load duration curve. This is the amount of time on the x-axis and the megawatts in descending order on the y-axis. So basically the highest amount of megawatts and the amount of time that it's spent at that generation level. Here we can also turn on the corresponding types of generation. So we can see at each demand what the corresponding type of generation was. So this is not chronological. This is in descending order of demand over time. We can also see the percentage of that time over here at the top. So say we want to see the top 10% of demand, we can zoom in like that, and we see that it was somewhere around 170 or 160 something. Because yeah. And then finally, let's go to the summary statistics. So these are just some interesting statistics over the period up here. So for example, the total generation, the total renewable generation, how much of the total generation was renewable, how many tons of CO2 were emitted. as well as other interesting statistics such as what was the average daily max over the period, average daily max generation, average daily min generation, the number of days with peaks in specific time periods. So this may not be so useful over the whole range, but if you look at it, say, over a season, you can see the peaks shift from morning peaks to evening peaks. Like, for example, in the winter time, most of the peaks are in the morning, and then as you start looking at the summer, they start shifting later and later in the day. You can also look at the period max generation, the time of the maximum carbon intensity, and the time of the minimum carbon intensity as well. And then this final tab is just the first one, the corrected generation, except over the entire period. So we can just see some things that strike the eye like directly from it, including the fact that hydro is increasing as the amount of generation. And then if we can go back to the slides, there are some caveats with the data. Aditi? Okay, so about the data, so the generation is only grid level, so we don't have any captive power or rooftop generation included in this. It's all from the SCADA data. So in addition to that, we defined generation, load met, consumption differently. So the generation is just the sum of the types of generation, but it only includes SCADA data. It doesn't include imports from Bhutan, but the SCADA data is not complete. It's missing some renewable generation, which Tabish will talk about later. The demand is defined as the demand at the state boundary. So so this is after losses and generation, interstate losses, yes. And that's why generation is a few percentage higher than demand. Okay. So we also have some limitations. For example, we have some errors in the data as well as missing data. We've corrected the errors as far as we could. The missing data we have not done anything with, so you may see some kind of like frozen time periods. In addition to that, the carbon emissions are based on a static multiplier. These are provided by a report from the CEA. So they don't take into account PLF, plant level variances, etc. And we don't have state level data, which again Tabish and Rahul will talk about later. Moving on. Or not? No. Sorry. Okay. So Tabish, you want to come up?
Thank you, Utkarsh. So now we will look at some of the preliminary findings from the data. And yeah, they are in the discussion note that we uploaded. So I'll just skim through them. You can find a detailed understanding of them in the report. Okay. So, yeah. So firstly, if you look at the daily highs and daily lows, so the highest total generation and the lowest total generation, we see that the difference between them has been decreasing from winters, from December till June 31st. So till now we were only being reported the daily highs, but now we have the daily lows, and the daily lows is an important number when you have to see how much, especially with more RE coming in, how much can you ramp down your capacity. So we see that earlier there was a higher ramping requirement, but now as we approach summers, the ramping requirement is a bit lower. Yeah. So I think Utkarsh already told you about the load duration curve. Let's just focus on one interesting point. So the RE is not going according to the load duration curve, definitely. But one thing is interesting is it's saying to you that, hey, I will not be there when you don't need me. So it will not be there when you need it, but it definitely is not there when you don't need it. So finally, if we zoom into the top 1% of the demand for the past 7 months, that's like 60 hours, we see that almost 5.5 gigawatts of capacity is only on for 60 hours. And that's an interesting question. Which capacity should it be? which will have a PLF of, I don't know, less than maybe 1%. So that's something we as planners, policymakers need to discuss, and the government especially. And this is just an average load curve for the month of December. Here we see that we have a small duck, but I mean it's relatively flat as most of India's load curves are. So we have, firstly, you see the first red line, that's the median daytime peak. The daytime peak is between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. So we see that's hovering around 10. And then we have the median daily peak, which is for the whole duration of 24 hours. And that's also in the morning heavily. And then we have the median renewable peak, which is somewhere around 12. If we move on, now these are the same curves for the 7 months from December to June. We see that although the renewable median peak remains almost constant, it doesn't move around because I mean solar is a major contributor and comes up in the day, so definitely it affects it. But we see that the daily peak has shifted from morning to evening, and then especially in the months of May and June, it has almost gone past 10. So this is a median, so we will have some peaks at 12, some peaks at 8. So this is another change that's happening. And we see that the daily load curve is also a bit more flat. On the other hand, the median daytime peak, we see that before the month of February it was around 10, but after that it has also shifted somewhere post noon. So yeah, and then what we thought to do was, since we have TOD based data and some of the most interesting times are the morning and the evening, because that's when we have ramping high demands. So we just wanted to, just a disclaimer that correlation of course is not causality. So we're just looking at how do these generations relate with each other. Who is ramping up, who is ramping down, and how are they interacting with each other. Of course, when the system changes, these will change because they are not exactly dependent upon each other. But so one of the interesting questions is who balances RE and how much. So here we see the first chart. We see that RE is being strongly negatively correlated with hydro, suggesting, though not like saying directly, that hydro is playing a major role in balancing of RE. And similarly, we have others. You can look at it more later. But I'll just try to say that this is a weekly correlations. So we see that although correlations vary over TOD, like in the morning it's different, in the evening for the same set of generations it's different, but also over time. In winters you have different kinds of correlations than in summers. Okay, I think it's on. Okay. So yeah, so now we also looked at the 15-minute ramp rates. Who is providing how much ramp in a 15-minute time slot, how much it's changing. And we found, as you can see, it's a thermal ramping, gas ramping, hydro, RE, and demand met ramping. And the lines that you see in each of them is this weekly moon standard deviation. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. How is it working? Okay. Yeah. No, we don't have that at a regional level, but I don't. So we were like, the highest ramps are being provided by thermal and hydro. And this is just showing us how the ramping requirement has decreased in line with the first graph here. We saw that as the difference between the daily high and the daily low was decreasing, so our ramping requirements will decrease. 15 minutes ramp. Yeah. So in aggregate, this is it. So it's almost similar. But then the story changes once we go on a percentage basis, because I mean thermal is 120 and we are talking about hydro, sometimes it's 20, sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 30, like right now. So on a percentage basis, we see that hydropower is the most agile of them all, followed by gas. And in fact, these are the two that are actually balancing our RE. So since hydropower was a bit more agile, and we decided to look a bit more at it. And so this is the graph which shows how the weekly hydropower capacity, firstly we have for the mornings, the evenings separately, and then the other time refers to 24 hours minus the time slots of 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. in the mornings and 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. in the evenings. And then the total time, the dotted line refers to the average 24 hours, how the capacity has been. So this is from 1st December to 26th of August, yesterday. So what we see is that their hydro is continuously increasing. Because monsoons, because glaciers are melting, so kind of hydro runs almost to its must-run status. So we reach a point where from graphically you can see buffer is around, let's say, 2 to 3 gigawatts between the morning highs and what it's being run at. So it is an important question. Maybe in future we'll be at a time where hydro is already a must run. Who is going to balance RE when RE increases in the system? Okay. Yeah. So Utkarsh already talked to you about we had errors. So the data that we have, we try to reconcile it with the monthly reports from POSOCO. And for the generation capacities, we found that it is varying, but mostly we find that the data that we have is a bit over-reported than what we are getting from the monthly reports from POSOCO. Again, like we have 3-minute, 5-minute resolution data, we are assuming that the data is constant for those 3 to 5 minutes. But then again, even if there's an error, logic says that over the course of it, plus minus, it should be almost zero. But we have, it tends towards positive. Yeah, daily MUs. So we multiplied it, kind of MUs. So then we also look for the same for our RE. So for RE we had one simple thing, solar is in the day, and other RE we don't know, like it can be 24 hours, it can be 12 hours. So on that basis of our knowledge that solar is just for those 12 hours, we try to tease out how much RE is being captured overall, how much of solar is being captured, and how much of other RE, which includes wind, biomass, small hydro, is being captured. So this is how it's looking like. Of course, we have made some assumptions, and we are still trying to improve upon this model. Then you can read a bit more on the discussion note. So we see that 60 to 70% of RE that is being generated in the country is being recorded by the tracker. So 30% maybe instrumentation has not gone online, some other issues, especially for smaller hydros and others, maybe we don't have instrumentation for them. And this is on the basis of how much RE is captured in day versus how much RE is captured in night. So we see that, and we are assuming here that the other RE that we mentioned previously, it's constant. It's big 24 hours same. And yeah, finally I'll hand it over to Rahul.
No, we're taking it at the bus bar Postdocs, same as POSO. No, so it's equal. Can you hold off that question? But essentially, supply is always injected wherever it's injected. It could be within the state boundaries, or it could be an CGS, which is anywhere, and then it crosses transmission interstate to reach the state boundaries. So that is only for the demand that there's a difference between them. The generation that POSOCO will record as a daily is always post-auxiliary at the grid level, which is exactly what the tracker, what their underlying data of SCADA is going to be capturing. It's the same feeder data. The only difference is monthly reports have daily totals of MUs generated, and we're assuming the daily calculations done post facto are a little more accurate because A, they have time to reconcile, and B, anytime someone says kilowatt hours, there's usually money on the table, so they're going to get it right. So this is the report, and it's a very important question, but we'll come back to more methodological details in a bit. So this is the report. I will not attempt to go through all of it, but a few insights that are important for our discussion coming up in a few minutes, which is really what is balancing our grid, for how long will the current situation persist. And so we're a country of, I mentioned 350 plus, yet the load met is about 180. So is there so much surplus? What happens is 350 is the gross capacity in the country. What is injected into the grid is not the same because power plants, especially thermal, consume some amount of electricity called auxiliary consumption, which could be in the order of 8%. So you lose a bunch of generation there. Then of course you have infirm. So out of your 350, somewhere in the order of 75 at the time of writing, now it's closer to 80, is renewable energy. So that is not treated as firm capacity as per planning. And it also, if you look at the tracker data, you will see that at the evening peak periods, it's contributing only a couple of % to your generation. So it's not available at certain peak periods. Then you've got the interstate transmission losses, which is the difference, especially for CGS, entering the state boundaries. But even when you add up all of these gaps, there's still a huge delta. And that is all classified as something called outages. Now it's a very interesting terminology, but these outages are of different types. Most people think of outages as the plant went down. So it turns out that outages are of several types. They're not only because of plant issues, technical issues, maintenance, failures, all of the above, but also if there's no fuel. You've heard about coal shortages, you've heard about gas supply problems. That is also termed as an outage and it's categorized as such. Then you've got no demand. So if there is no demand or low demand, two separate categories, it's technical what the difference is, but this is essentially a demand side problem. That is also treated as an outage. The plant has been shut down for 24 hours, so for that day it's under outage, is how it's reported by the government. So we've looked at all of this over a 12-month period and categorized these across all the plants for which data are available. And we find that the majority of outages, this is just one day to give you an example, majority of outage was actually a technical fault, technical maintenance, but there is some, fourth column, coal shortage. So lack of fuel is a problem. So what we then did was we said, let's call two types of outages recoverable, meaning your existing capacity can actually go meet that much demand. And those are, you get enough fuel and there's enough demand and a willing buyer. Assuming those are met, this much additional demand can be met. And so these are 12-month sort of snapshots, representative days, just for this visualization. And it's in the order across gas and coal put together. Total is in the order of 30 GW. So that's the recoverable up to the point of the analysis when we had done it. So then what we did was we projected this and said, let's take that recoverable and then look at demand growth and alternative supply growth over the next few years. And we found that, and this was for 3 different demand growth periods of 5%, 6%, and 7% from a demand perspective. So there's a separate calculation. My colleague Sahil is here. He has a paper on the demand growth in India for 2022 and 2030. We're using those numbers. And what we find is under one scenario, there's 81 different scenarios in the paper, n-dimensional. We find that your surplus may disappear in about 3 years because your demand is growing by about 10 GW, even in fact higher most recently per annum. Now, the elephant in the room that has been unmentioned is environmental, sorry, I have to point that way. Next, please. Flue gas desulfurization and other environmental norms. So this is the trajectory that is planned as per the CEA reports and industry consultative sort of action and ministry planning. And you'll notice that it's very tail heavy. We're sort of saying, wait a minute, if you're going to do it, you should make it front heavy while you've got a surplus. Because to meet these, you're going to need to take the plants down for somewhere between 2 to 4, maybe 6 months if you're doing all the criteria pollutants. So otherwise, you're going to lose in the order of 6 to 12, maybe 14, 15 GW as downtime for retrofitting based on this sort of a schedule. So that's another issue. We don't even know how many plants would get retired. That's another question. Depends on the commercials and the economics. We have an expert here, Karthik. We may call on you to share some thoughts in the discussion point of that. So now we're going to move to our panel discussion. If I could invite Thomas and Mr. Mingani to join me on the stage. And our other panelist is on the way. He's got caught in a ministry meeting with the minister and secretary, but I believe that's where he is. But if I could invite you to please join us for some discussions. And while we're doing that, I want to take just a moment to acknowledge and thank the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, who have supported this research. So as an institution, we rely on partnerships with our collaborators and supporters. So thank you to them. So, sorry, next slide. Sorry. Yeah. What can you do with granular data that you couldn't do otherwise? So this is one example where I want to show you just some first back of the envelope digging that we've done with an RE-centric sort of view. What we've tried to estimate is today your RE is being handled thanks to a couple of things. You've got flexing or cycling down your coal plants to a lower PLF as a capability. You've got hydro, which can go up and down. And in theory, gas could also be more easily swung. So we calculated every day between 11 and 2 p.m., 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., midday, what is the lowest where you are at in thermal generation, which is coal, non-gas. And then we compared that to the maximum coal generation in 24 hours left or right. Because the theory is you don't want to switch on and off a coal plant in a one-day period. And so then we asked, what is that percentage? Clearly it's going to be lower than 100%. Let's assume that number is say 90% or 85%. Then we say, why can't you come down to your limit, which is supposed to be 55%, and translated that into a certain gigawatts capacity. Then we added, let's shut off all that gas in that time period. So we are doing a start-stop for gas. And we added in 50% of hydro could come down, just as a thought exercise. Now, you could say, why don't you switch off all your hydro? Well, you've seen that hydro is almost turning must-run. Maybe it cannot be switched off. Or maybe all of it can be switched off. Again, that's something we don't have an answer to. It's an assumption-based, just a indicative. And what we find is the summation of these three capabilities of balancing RE. Midday. Why midday? Because we want to ask, how much solar can you inject before your system has problems? And what we find is, you've had in the order of, 50 to 60 GW of ability in your system to handle more solar. Now on certain days, you can actually literally see January 26th, Holi and other holidays in this sort of a schema, when demand this really shifts, but at least 45 GW. Now ask yourself what is happening to the RE trajectories, and we'll come to this hopefully in the discussion. How much are we going to grow each year? Now, as we grow RE, our demand is also growing, so your floor is also going to grow. So if, thought exercise, you grow solar at 25 a year, and your demand grows at 10, that means you're adding in the middle of the day an additional 15. That's excluding any wind growth or any other firm must-run type of power that cannot be switched off in the middle of the day. So 45 divided by 15 is 3 years. So at 3 years, you're going to need huge load shifting or storage or curtailment, i.e. throwing away RE. That's the first order indicative that this is hinting at. That's what we're able to do as an illustrative example. Welcome. Thank you. We're in fact haven't started the panel. So the questions sort of to the panel to prime it. One is, of course, from our analysis and data, we have a wish list. This is fantastic data the government makes available. So thank you. I mean, the government, I think, Ghanshyamji, you've been responsible for getting some of these data out there, like the merit data. So all scholars and policymakers thank the government for getting it out. But of course, we always want more. So what we want with data is more granular data, plant level data, state data, curtailment data. Nobody knows how much RE is being curtailed. We have estimates. We are not talking about commercial curtailment, but even technical curtailment. We don't have, other than aggregate or average numbers, we don't have that. Another lesson or wish list is, as we look at simulations like CERC and POSOCO have been doing on market systems, security-based constrained economic dispatch, we have to go beyond CGS only. We have to go beyond thermal. As we had seen, hydro has turned into a must-run. So your belief that you can just switch off your hydro may not be entirely true, at least all periods in the year. So we also would like solar versus wind versus RE breakdowns, because today we're just lumping all the RE into one. Carbon, we want to move beyond static multipliers. What happens to the carbon emissions as plants change their outputs under flexing conditions? Efficiency loss, PLF linkage, these are all well understood, but there's no standardized data for these. We haven't even talked about economics, which is a different, different elephant in a different room. So to prime the panel, some opening sort of just thoughts, then I have some questions. We've seen that it seems handling 175 gigawatt RE is mostly doable. That's the finding of some studies. There's some limitations to them. But yes, with effort, good interstate transmission, because states already, RE is concentrated, are facing difficulties. So much of our effort has been towards the 175. One of the questions to the general panel is not 175, but we have targets just 8 years later talking of 275, 350, and now 500 even, 500. That's where the real action is going to start hitting you. The outages paper report sort of implies that the NPA problem, underutilization, in a few years will start to work itself out. Question is, do the banks and do others have that appetite for a few years? 1 year data obviously isn't enough, so a caveat for the tracker, for those who play with it, don't look at the decimal places or a number, look at the trends and the indicative, which are much more valuable. And importantly, the average PLFs aren't sufficient. They're meaningful, they aren't meaningful enough. So if you see, gas was that steady blue line, very steady. It was about 6 GW most of the time, a little bit of up and down. So that would imply a PLF of about 25% on your gas units, little plus or minus. But it's not 25% across the plants. You've got a bunch of plants with zeros. Same in coal. Your NTPC PLF is higher than others. Your pithead PLFs are much higher than non-pithead power plants, etc. So locational issues matter enormously, both for the grid and on commercial bases. Hydro we've already discussed, but hydro is not growing as much. So if it's been your savior thus far, you saw that on a percentage basis, it had the highest contribution for the balancing. What do we do? How does it change? And yes, there is a duck in the room. The duck curve is visible. So one of the recommendations is we should start looking at net demand, not just the demand curve, but the net demand. So even if you have a lot of solar, and let's say we shift our pump sets to solar, it will not change the evening peak, which is where today's net demand peak is pronounced. So these are some of the questions. And now, turning over to the panel. So, any thoughts, reactions to the general sort of question that today's equilibrium is quite comfortable. How do you see things changing on either the demand front or the supply front, both in a couple of years time frame? So before we jump into the questions, you've seen in the invite we have with us Mr. Ghanshyam Prasad, Chief Engineer at the Ministry of Power. He's been looking over the operations, the monitoring, keep the entire grid in some ways from the ministry with a technical background. You were at CEA before, sir?
Yes.
So has been in that hat as well. We have also Mr. Vijay Mengani, who's Chief Engineer for RE and Grid Integration at CEA. And with me, Thomas Spencer, Fellow at TERI, who's also been looking at this larger transition issue in some detail. So thank you for joining us. So any opening remarks from all of you, either about what you've seen or heard, or what you see, you know, as they say in the stock market world, the past is no predictor of the future. Anyone who'd like to jump in, sir?
Actually, I want to start with a your thanks for the Merit India portal. Within 2 minutes, I will tell you the background. CA has the regulation for collection of information. Around 10 years back, we have regulation. We have around 68 formats. But the Merit India portal we have made in around 15 days. There was a suspicion that the states are not following merit order operation. It was very difficult at that time to get the commercial data, because that merit order data they never get to center. It will given only to the state regulator only at the end of the year. So it was a very challenging exercise, and ministry has given us a window of almost 10 days to make this application, because all Mr. Controls were there. And at that time we thought how we can incentivize the people to give data. So we have given a new phrase. तुम मुझे data दो मैं तुम्हें पैसा दूँगा. We have clearly shown them what is the advantage for them to give the data. We have shown them that by sharing the data, you will see the opportunity of saving in the power procurement cost. And we have given certain sometimes higher figure also to incentivize that. It was found that within 15 days, compliance started coming. And at that time I also told them, we are only giving the background data. After 2 years, 3 years, there will be a lot of people which will give you a lot of insight in this data. We are just giving a data framework, but there will be consultants. Like a lot of consultants are now doing data scraping on this single portal. My KPMG consultant is giving consultancy to Telangana, and Telangana is saving daily 16 lakhs of rupees. Similarly, a lot of people like Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, these are using this merit order portal for data scraping and direct insight and direct saving. And without giving any regulation, only giving 3 formats, data started coming. So whenever we talk about the data, like now I am starting collecting renewable energy data. Earlier, 4 months earlier, 5 months earlier, we have no visibility. So we have to incentivize them that why they should give the data. And once this type of insights come, they will be incentivized that this data can be used in their daily power system operation. So this will be the benchmark that this application will give them insight for future operations.
So before we turn over, you used one word that latched on to many scholars in this room, which is scraping. And in the ideal world, it should be available through an XML or through a portal that the government allows you to download it more easily. And I think it's a great start. We need even more granular data to really get into the more nuances of ramping, time of day, etc. Because even what is there has some limitations or assumptions in what is there. So this was an effort of gathering. As far as we know, this is the first of its kind, but a lot of scholars and researchers, like you mentioned, KPMG have been working with the CA and others have worked. We have a lot of one-off efforts. If we could institutionalize this, is one of the requests, and you know, as scholars, as an institution, this is something that we do. TERI has done some of these things, others, CEW has done some of it. So I think this is a separate conversation, that data is something that people may thrive on because that's their bread and butter, but it's like you said, it's really an enabler for operations, but also for planning.
Well, thank you, Rahul, for getting me at the last moment as well.
Delighted you could join us, sir.
I was struck in one of the meetings. Definitely, the data as such, I mean, you can look at it in 2 ways. Either it is abstract data which doesn't have any value. Second is the data, if analyzed properly, gives you a lot of value. So, I mean, electricity sector as is per se, if you go back around 15 years, 20 years back, everything was almost centralized in the entity who were looking at that particular activity, whether it was generation, transmission, distribution, or whoever. Entire kitty, in fact, I can recall even the year I joined in CA, that was 91. Even getting data from my counterpart division was very difficult. The moment I used to ask for, okay, I need this information, the reply used to be, please come through a proper channel. Later has to be approved by the chief engineer at that time, and later used to go to the other division and used to get the data. So, from a compartmentalized concept, now it has to be a transparent concept, and this we started bringing in CA as well as in other places as well for last 10 years, I think. IMS kab aaya tha? Do you remember? IMS, Information Management Center, I think 2005, 2006. And that was the time when we started integrating the data. In 2014, the buzzword started about the transparency. So you could see a lot of apps coming from the ministry, almost, and our target was at least one app per week. Of course, we could not achieve that target, but definitely on an average, we were able to bring out 6-7 apps in a particular year. That continued for 2 years, and then we found that, okay, now it is almost saturating. And in that period only, we came around all these apps, whether it was Vidyut Prabha, Tarang, or Merit app, all these apps started coming in. Then we started working on why not to have a national power portal. What was the idea of that? The idea was that all the power data should be housed at one place, which can be used by anybody. Incidentally, we have been working very hard to populate that particular portal with all the kinds of information. I am not sure, you can tell us what is the success rate, but I particularly feel that still it has not succeeded to an extent what we exactly wanted. We wanted that all the kinds of data should be available on the National Power Portal, which can be useful for all sectors, whether anybody looking at the generation side or transmission side or distribution side, or per se any researcher who is like to do some studies in the college, particularly these engineering students who wants a lot of data when he is trying to analyze, or anybody for that matter, anybody doing some statistics, statistical institute, data mining or data analysis, those people, they definitely need those kind of power data. In fact, I have been in ministry, I have been approached by some of the students who are taking their research in power sector, and they came and met me, and they were also finding a lot of difficulty in collecting the data about Indian power sector as such. Something we could help out, some we could not, because of the way the data is right now structured in the country. So focus of the ministry has been that, okay, can we try to make it more and more transparent? How can we populate more data into the system, which can be used by one and all? Of late, we have in CA, I think Meghani can update you better, because we had started a system of registry. I don't know whether that guidelines was approved by the ministry, and I'm sure it might have started, wherein all the generators were asked to register themselves onto a portal. The idea again there was that why not all these generation data after delicensing, we found that the generation data is not even coming to CA, and we were losing a lot of informations. So, and the moment you start getting that kind of, creating that kind of simple registry, it's not a very complicated process. You simply log in, put your data, and that generate a simple ID for that, and that ID becomes your benchmark. Just like what we have a Aadhaar number for ourselves. The moment we put Aadhaar number, and particularly all your data, whatever is there in that system, can be fetched by simply putting the Aadhaar number. Similarly, by simply giving that generation ID, the entire data of that particular generating stations can be traced upon. So that registry plus what we wanted further is can that be linked to certain parameters of the generation or transmission or distribution. Lot much things is to be done. I think Brookings can further do more research to guide us what exactly is the need of the hour and where we should really focus on. Of course, I can't say that all of them are not important. Definitely, all of these data are important, but given constraints of the resources, we have to prioritize what is more required and what is less required, and that way we can proceed further. That is as far as the data part is concerned. You mentioned something regarding the renewable study, RE study, and how far we are prepared about 175, 225, 275, 300 and even 500 gigawatt of RE. Ministry has been going very cautiously in this, and in 2014 when 14-15 when we were really targeting about 175, all of us were not very sure how it is going to be integrated into the system. But after this study which was carried out by NREL with the US, I think Sikandar is already here, so he knows the entire history. So in I think by 2015 end, I think we concluded that study and we started getting a feeler that okay, by doing these action points, we will be able to integrate this entire 175 gigawatt in a very smooth manner. Those action points are well listed in that report, and those action points have also been completed. Most of them have been completed. So last year, in fact, we thought that, I mean, 22 is right now approaching, but we don't stop at 22, and we have to really go for 27, 30, and that kind of time frame. So another committee was constituted last year, and that committee report is also final. I think it might have been hosted onto the ministry's website, or maybe hosted in a couple of maybe in a couple of days. Maybe within 10 days it can be hosted, because that report has already been finalized, and there also what the idea of that report was that we need to review what exactly was the study of 2015. Did the recommendation go and fetch the results what it was intended to? Second was, the moment we go in a time frame of 27, say 275 or 2030 or any kind of numbers that you say, how fairly we are prepared to take care of that kind of situations. So all these recommendations are again coming in that. Next step is, with these kind of recommendations, we are also going to carry out these studies which probably we could not do at the time when we were studying for 175, and that is the transient and stability study. These were the two studies which were not carried out at that particular time. Number churning was there. We could get to a good feeler, and right now also, because of good mix of energy mix in the country, we don't face much of a problem. Because its equation is 196 gigawatt of coal versus almost around 60 gigawatt of wind and solar. So practically right now we are able to balance them even with some kind of flexible operation of coal based generation. But the moment we keep on moving towards higher and higher wind and solar, probably this ratio is going to be not matching and may not be favorable. If it is not favorable, then definitely we need the concerns becomes more how then which are the elements that can be helpful for balancing part. As most of you are aware that if you really see the energy mix of the country right now, majorly we are dependent on coal with 196 or even 200 gigawatt. Hydro again is either run of the river type or small pondage, not going to be helpful much. Gas, definitely we have something like 25 gigawatt, but hardly 12 to 13 gigawatt is giving us some result with a very low PLF of around 25 to 26%. Gas visibility is not there, even if we depend on the imported RLNG and all, which is going to be very costly, and probably it may not serve the purpose what was intended at that time when we thought that Reliance gas will be available, and the capacity came during that time. So gas again is not probably going to be the option. So the only thing that is left out is depending on coal and whatever is in the pipeline. Second, what we are now thinking is can we take advantage of hydro, and that is how the push to hydro has started, and pump storage. Both of these are going to now come in the vision document of Ministry of Power as well. The task that is going to be assigned to us officially. Of course, we have already started working on this particular line, that is promoting hydro and pump storage, which can take care of the balancing part. This seems to be a low-hanging fruit for India because we do have a potential, hydro potential, as well as the pump storage can easily be built. Battery, definitely battery storage is.
So we'll come back to storage in a bit. There's a
Okay.
so,
Okay.
yeah.
So I stop here.
Thank you. I mean, let's move from the data and granularity in these to really these questions that Kanchamji and Venganji had sort of flagged. So right now we are relying on the coal. Like you said, coal will do a lot of the flexing in some of these. How long will the current situation last, or where do you see sort of trigger points, Thomas, maybe? So one of the questions people always ask is, there's some coal capacity under construction today. Very few greenfield is envisaged but will that be sufficient if you want to retire? I forget, Karthik, how much is the retirement plan under the emissions 30?
60 you're adding, so I think it becomes 244 is what I think the target is.
Yeah. Yeah, 22. So net, you have some potential only. And then, but would you ever come to a point where you have to take a call that I need to build new capacity because I've exhausted? Because as the outages report and the other data show, we don't have as much slack as headline numbers would have claimed because your load met was only 180 and yet your capacity is 355. So any sort of opening thoughts, Thomas?
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, first of all. And although I will answer your question, I do want to make a couple of comments on the data portal that you have presented. First of all, I wanted to very warmly congratulate you, but also preceding you, the Ministry of Power and CEA, for this initiative that now goes back 2 years for putting the data together. As you were making the presentation, I was sitting there with actually a bit of regret that it was not Terry that had done this, very honestly. I think it's a really wonderful initiative, so warmest congratulations to you and the team. I think this is so important because although the issues that you have highlighted in the presentation of the data portal have always been important to the power sector, the power sector has always been driven by the need to balance demand and supply in every moment at every location in the grid.
Or load shed.
Or load shed. Exactly, and this is why I think it is so important. Namely, if you think of, what are the laws of the socio-economic system that is the power system, it is driven by this need to balance load with supply at every moment in time. But I think the impact of that law in India has been muted in the past, partly because you could load shed, partly because supply was always rather base load, and partly because the load profile was always a bit flat with that load shedding. And I think we are now moving into a world where that paradigm of you need to optimize the system according to the sub-annual hourly balancing is now becoming more and more important for India. With the growth of renewables, the potential for the load profile to change significantly, and the growing inacceptability of load shedding. So that law of which shapes the power system is going to become more and more constraining in India. And I think in that context, having this sub-annual, hourly, 15-minute data becomes so much more important than it was in the past. So let me now come to your, and there's, just to finish on that point, there's many things that I think, you know, we would love to add to this kind of data portal. Certainly to take it down to the state level. To add in more details regarding specific generating units, regarding different RE sources and so on. But it's a great start, and I'm sure it will grow over time. Now, to come back to your question, so in the analysis that we have done at Terry, we certainly share your conclusion that in the absence of further measures to make the grid more flexible, the power system more flexible, we will be coming up against constraints in how much renewables we can integrate into the power system before too long. That means sometime in the early to mid 2020s. If we continue with the trajectory towards 175 gigawatts and then beyond that. And obviously that creates the need to increase the flexibility of the power system. I think, of course, the key thing is, can you push the minimum generation of the coal-fired power plants lower in the short term? But more importantly, can we generalize that requirement, including to state plants? And I think actually Mr. Mengani made a very interesting comment where he said that in a federal structure, the use of transparency, the use of data to nudge states in the right direction is really important. And I would see, for example, the behaviour of the state-owned thermal generating stations as an area where transparency could play this role as well. Definitely the potential of load shifting would allow us to integrate more renewables and make better use of the renewables production, particularly solar in the daytime, if we can shift some agricultural pumping to daytime, and I think that's happening anyway because of the drive from the farmers to have daytime power. Like you said, it doesn't really deal with the problem of the evening peak, to the extent that evening peak is not coming from pumping but from other sources. And certainly in the analysis that we have done, we have seen over the historical data a similar trend to the one that you highlighted, which is that in the summer months of June and July, the evening peak is no longer an evening peak, it's a nighttime peak. So it's becoming both later and it's lengthening. It's not a peak, it's a plateau at night with air conditioning. And that raises, you know, real issues for the growth of renewables, particularly solar. Which brings in the issue of storage, pump storage, battery storage. We will certainly need some in the 2020s, which means we need to start now with the growth of storage. And I think we're definitely moving in the right direction with the tenders that have been brought out by SECI, the documents coming out of CEA and the Ministry of Power indicating a very important role for storage in the sort of vision for the 2030 capacity mix. But definitely I would say that, you know, it's 50-50 in my view whether the increase in the flexibility of the power system will happen fast enough for us to meet our renewables ambitions, or whether we'll have to take the foot off the brake a little bit in the early 2020s.
I want to add one thing.
Please. Yeah.
Like your question is regarding surplus power. We have observed in last 20 years almost that our energy demand is increased gradually, but our peak demand is quite fluctuating. 1 year it become 1.2%, and the next year it become 8.2%. So it is a very erratic. Why you are doing? You have told me that only for 50 hours in a year this type of demand comes.
With 1 year data. Yes, that's the caveat. Yes.
It is like that. So after analysis, if I think by 2020, what is my target is 226 gigawatt. With the present time, I am not seeing it moving beyond 206 gigawatt. So there is a comfort on the demand side, but demand side is on the basis of assumption that what is happening business as usual. Like UP at present also is having 18 hours power supply schedule in many towns. If this change to 24/7, there may be an issue, but that will add only around 3,000 megawatt in that supply. Similarly, on the supply side, our only worry is solar, which we have assumed. It is energy side. What we are assuming the solar rooftop 40 gigawatt, which we are far away around 4,000 megawatt as per private sources, and as per government sources, it is around 2,000 megawatt. So on the evening and night peak issue, At present, what you are seeing, it is a distorted view on the system. It is a normal, it is a system operation intervention which is moving the load from evening peak to night. In certain cases, like in UP, industries are allowed to take power only after 10 p.m. So our load shift, this peak load coming only due to UP load in the night from 10 to 12 in summer month. If no intervention is there, every supply is given, so it may move around 9 or 10 p.m. So it will not happen at around 8.
So I think that's another area. We've been looking supply side. The whole demand side issue is a whole separate issue on load curve shapes, but also this concept of unrestricted demand. Nobody knows what it is because we've never actually fulfilled it, let alone the economic growth and affluence and availability of appliances and aspirations or claims of warming of the earth, so therefore we need more air conditioners. I mean, that's the cyclical argument in some ways. You mentioned, Sanjay, about the moves towards storage, and clearly we need these for multiple reasons, not just RE, but also for smoothing the peaks and valleys and a number of other benefits that these have. But it comes to that other elephant in the room which we alluded to earlier, which is pricing. Today, time of day pricing is something that is understood as needed. It has been discussed, but not yet implemented in very meaningful ways. And let me now explicitly distinguish between consumer time of day, retail, and wholesale. Retail consumer A will take a lot of time. You have to change the metering infrastructure. Delhi is probably the pioneer where all consumers over 20 kVA have to have it, but in most time of day implementations, the incentive price wise is very minimal. It's about 1 rupee-ish. So most shifts don't occur. So that will take time. But on the supply side, 90-ish% of power is transacted through PPAs, which have no differentiation between power sold at 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. And so that leads to this question that if I have a storage technology, and at a technology level, policy should be agnostic, whether it's pumped hydro, lithium-ion battery, concrete, I mean, there's so many things. Thermal storage as an end user is another, even demand response. All of these may play. The question is, all of them will have a cost. Where do you see the timeline as well as the spreads in time of day pricing, wholesale wise? Power exchange, every time I say this, people say, but we have a power exchange. Well, that's not very representative. It's not very liquid either, because power exchange shows so much volatility in pricing. Things shift so much. And so time of day is great. Yeah, Thomas, for the wholesale side.
Yeah, for the wholesale side, it's a good distinction. Actually, the power exchange doesn't shift at all if you compare it with the global perspective. So if you look at the sort of average daily peak to trough price differential, it's about 1 rupee per kilowatt hour, right? If you look at it in other markets, it can be orders of magnitude or multiple orders of magnitude. So in South Australia, for example, the wholesale market price can be as low as 10 Australian dollars per megawatt hour or as high as 10,000 to draw in supply when needed. And obviously, you know, the average market price is quite affordable, but you're getting that in ERCOT in Texas. There was last week, I think, a lot of Twitter action because the market price had gone up to $10,000 per megawatt hour. So if we are going to get the incentives to come from the wholesale market, we have to be ready for that level of price volatility. And I think, frankly, that is still a long way off in India. And this means that, for me, the solution has to come in PPA structuring and contracting in the short to mid-term. So we need to start getting the practice of time of day PPAs, seasonal PPAs, much more use of those instruments. And I think the deep portal is a very interesting move in that direction, because a lot of the PPAs that you see there are seasonal, they have a time of day component. So I think more study of what kind of PPAs are being signed on the deep portal would help us give us a sense of what kind of contracting structures would help DISCOMs to meet their supply-demand gap without spending all out on a new coal-fired power plant with a 25-year fixed cost PPA, because your analysis shows that net load is going to
Relatively flat.
net load is going to become more volatile as we get more renewables in the system, and this means that given Discom's demand supply gap on a net load basis will always be 10%, 15%, 20% of hours in the year. A new coal-fired power plant on a 25-year fixed cost basis is not going to serve that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Shall we?
Yeah, please.
I think you raise a very valid question regarding the PPA. 90% remaining with the PPA and the TOD tariff, right? What is the way out? This question I had been asking for last 4 years, at least since I have been in this particular area. How do I really go about? Do I change the PPA terms? Can I change the PPA terms?
Well, apparently states think that you can do anything with the PPA.
Right? So ultimately, after a lot of churning, what we could only see is can we deepen the market? That's the only viable solution that comes to our mind, and in that direction we have been moving forward. The only problem, of course, in that process only we had introduced the portal from ministry right now, which takes care of your short term, wherein you have that time slotting as well as seasonal variations, etc., etc. But that's not enough, because still it takes care of only the incremental requirement of the discoms. If you really have to do a sea change or change to an extent of the entire PPA regime, then definitely the entire power market of the country has to change. And if that has to change, that means you'll have to have a product like futures, options. There has to be a speculators. There has to be, all the financial instruments has to be brought in. How do I bring in India? In the present framework, when we have two regulators, one is the physical delivery is being taken care by the CRC. Financial instruments are being regulated by SEBI. So there is a huge tussle between the two regulators in their jurisdiction, and that is how the case is still lying in the Supreme Court. Probably you know the history about it. We have taken that initiative from ministry how to resolve this particular case. Most likely tomorrow we are ending up to some consensus between CRC and SEBI to agree to withdraw that particular case from Supreme Court. And we have now clearly demarcated, in fact we had formed a committee in ministry to look into this particular aspect of the financial markets as such. The moment we are able to do this, and our target is more or less, I can say, in a time frame of next, if we are, we agree tomorrow to do this, then in a time frame of next 6 months, we should be able to introduce this kind of system in the country. Now, when it comes to this, then how do I take the PPAs there? Can we have a capacity market? Right now the debate is going on between the capacity market or the energy market. Should India move from an energy market to capacity market to take care of these PPAs? So we will be taking a decision on that very shortly, but at least 99% chance is there that we may even move towards the capacity market to take care of all these PPA. And the moment capacity starts getting traded into these financial markets, then both things are going to happen. The PPA gets turned into the financial products. At the same time, whenever these are going to be required or traded as far as the licensees are concerned, they can get this power through the DAM, that is day ahead market or the intraday or the balancing market or whatever market that comes into, which can easily be that part of the physical delivery can be taken by the CRC. We are also going to have a chapter on power market. That's what we are trying to design, and Electricity Act will try to cover that chapter in the power market. And I mean, what we are trying to do is, can we, because simply taking a TOD meter for a generator and trying to set a tariff by a regulation, probably that's not going to help. That's our thinking. And that is how we want that market to decide this kind of time of the day tariff. And the moment the volume starts getting deepening into the dam or the day ahead or the intraday or the or term ahead market, probably this will automatically keep on happening. So that's the vision what the ministry is looking at.
So the challenge with markets is people either love them or hate them depending on what the equilibrium looks like. When supply is very high, wholesale prices fall, and so markets look brilliant. And yet, like you pointed out, Thomas, that you have swings that maybe are actually a feature, not a bug of what you need. So one side is what happens in a couple of years, because let's move forward a couple of years, because the next few years are mostly already planned. So now demand has grown. We don't add so much cold capacity, but we do add a huge amount of RE. And so the surplus starts to go away. So now we are approaching not only equilibrium shifting, but now the regional, national versus state issues kick in. So these are all, the tracker shows national data. But what is it, Vijayji, what percentage comes from the south? 45? More than half the RE generation came from 2 states in India at particular times of the. So one of the challenges that one of the senior officials there told me was, look, you can give me infinite transmission, but when I'm surplus is when my neighbors are also surplus. And when I'm deficit or evening peak, for example, is when there's no liquid market available. And so how do you see this transition, this sort of granularity also playing out? Certainly, I fully agree with your observation. We shouldn't regulate a time of day tariff. That would be a dangerous move. It may help short run, but it may not help long term. But then, how do we handle the winners and losers? Because with any transition, it's not that people necessarily say that the long-term equilibrium is bad. It's how do we get there?
In one like PPA case, I want to add that the shortage scenario and in the surplus scenario, how people accept the PPA conditions are very different. In today's condition, when we are setting surplus, there are the DISCOM saying to a wind generator, okay, I will accept your repowering proposal, but I will purchase only power for 5 years. And there is a renewable generator who do not want to enter the market. So unless we have some protected players or preferred players who do not want to enter the market dynamics, do not want to take risk, they want a perfect cash flow to suit their financer, our market cannot become deep. What is happening, unless renewable have to realize its own value. And it's like we are talking about storage. Gas we are comparing for since last 3 months, it is not viable. But I see a scenario that before storage, my gas can become a very viable option for balancing. Because cost of the gas is now you have taken analysis up to 2030 US shale gas. At my Indian border itself, at half the price, not a half, around 1/3 price, I can balance the scenario of the gas. But what is becoming happening, we are operating under constant, like my energy mix study. It assumes that my capacity of gas will remain 25,000, I will operate it at 22% because gas price will remain 7 rupees 50 paisa. These are a continuous evolving market. So storage, before storage, already existing resources can be used for balancing. For that, I recommend that the renewable should come into the market without any protection. Renewable should not think that only through a contract or PPA type of thing they can enter into market. And then they can have a higher value also. At present 2 rupees 50 paisa, 3 rupees only. There will be a time if I structure my ancillary market correctly, my market design correctly, it may get twice the price, same renewable.
But given the enormous, I mean, admirably ambitious growth of RE, to extend Thomas's point on volatility, you now often have seen in other countries, thanks to RE, negative prices for energy. And it's not clear either from a LDC or a system level perspective, but even also from the developer's perspective. Are they willing to go down that risk path where if you don't have, I mean, people like PPAs not only for high profit margins per se. In theory, a market and a PPA should come near each other, otherwise something's out of equilibrium on one of the two ends. But it's really that
data
there's
insight.
that risk.
There is a data insight. From 12 July onward, there is a complaint of curtailment. We find that there is a lot of power, and even after best effort of managing within the regional grid, X state is not able to absorb all the wind power. And there was a possibility that wind power can come to the market. But structurally, nobody is ready to get the power into market. And then we blame particular state for curtailment, etc. By making best use of my flexibility. There is a certain limits like 55% shutdown is there, or 70% curtailment is there. But even after there is a limit for a particular state, like you are told. When I am surplus in monsoon season, my neighbor is also surplus. But my grid is so strong that I can move this power to northern part of the country. But it was not possible because people are not ready to come into the market. Their contracts are like that. I am married to you, I cannot move out of that. Even if the possibility of selling outside is available.
So before we open it up to questions, there's a lot of folks I'm sure waiting. A last thought on just this tracker and visibility and apps. I mean, the government has pioneered a lot of apps. Thinking of consumers, this is the other side, not just on time of day pricing, but overall behavior, appliances and consumption. Are people really ready or even interested to know enough about electricity to change their behavior other than through pricing or load shedding as instruments? Always people were engaged through these two instruments. Everyone wants a lower bill, ideally not through the Delhi solution, but also through energy efficiency. But we also have had load shedding as a reason people were engaging with the grid. Now in a smarter sort of a future, do you think not directly this tracker, but similar platforms where now consumers are told, plug in your electric vehicle at this time? Because the electric vehicle is one of these very interesting beasts, which A is very large in energy requirements, and B often has some flexibility of when it can be plugged in. So that's just one example. Now, again, this is where you have to say, do I believe the targets? One extreme target was 100% electric vehicles by 2030 as being sold. If that happens, that's an enormous impact on the grid, but some people are saying, well, it may not happen so quickly. So two wrongs make a right, or it's a math double negative sort of may be happening. So do we think people are ready for thinking about electricity so differently than they did in the past?
No.
Straight flat. Is that an Indian? But no. So the other, so I'll push back and just say, every time someone says India doesn't do X or does X, maybe niches are there. And a niche in India is bigger than a country in Europe.
Yeah, so I mean, my perspective on this, and it's also informed a lot by what has happened in developing countries, is that you can do something with, you know, slab-wise time of day pricing, which could have a seasonal component as well. So people will run their washing machines at night if the tariff is much lower there and so on. But in the aggregate, it doesn't make too much of a difference. I think the evidence from developed countries which have tried to get retail competition in there is that even if you try to make switching suppliers as simple as possible, people treat utilities as sort of a locked-in expense. The time cost of researching is so high. So I'm not super confident, and this holds in India but also globally, that people will stop treating electricity as something that is just there. You pay for it, but it's there, and they don't think about it too much.
It does have a potential in industries.
Yes. Yes.
Domestic probably may not have, because I mean, the time you need electricity, you will definitely switch on. But industry does have a lot of potential the moment you go for the DRs, demand response, and introduce demand response in the industries.
we need a price signal also.
Yeah, price signal has to be there. Price
That's
signal
one of
has
the
to-
bottlenecks we have for storage
that's
time.
true. That's true.
Actually, correct price is also required for domestic, etc. I remember in CRC, you are the regulator.
See, the enabler is something different.
But
Enabler is,
after 5
does
PM
your distribution company have the information, right information about the consumer? Probably not.
After 5
So that
PM,
means you'll have to have some kind of smart meters already installed so that you keep on, I mean, two-way communication is there.
Sorry,
but commercial is ready to adopt. Like in CRC, you are the regulator. But when we are told that after 5 PM, if you take a photocopy paper, you have to get the power cost at a double price or 1.5 times. So we stop the printing after 5 PM because commercial is totally convenient for the implementation. But the DSM study for the domestic consumer could not find a benefit because pricing for the domestic consumer is not correct. If the retail tariff for the domestic consumer is right, then he can give me a better DSM.
So, thank you everyone. I'd like to open it up to questions. We've had very patient folks waiting. Vivek, please introduce yourself very briefly and a short question, please. We're already over time, but we do want to.
Just, not really questions, but few observations and just
Is the mic on? Sorry.
But I am audible, right?
But we do need it for the online folks. Yeah.
So, I'm Vivek Sen and manage the power program at Shakti, Renewable Energy Foundation. One quick observation on the peak and the trough difference in the day ahead market.
Sir, could you
on
tap the mic just to
exchanges.
check? No, it's not on. Can we just give them the other mic, please? Sorry. Just because folks online may not hear you otherwise. Tap it on the
Yeah.
head. Smack it on the head. That's what my family does. Yes.
Yeah. So the observation was that yes, on an average, you don't see much differential. It's like a rupee on an average, but you do see a lot of differentials between the different slots. Like in the peak hours, you might see a differential of as high as 4 or 5 rupees as well. The other thing was what Sir said about the potential power market design. I think it's a great step, and but as far as I understand of the proposed market design is that it would essentially be an energy pool kind of a thing, wherein the capacity charges are still settled out of the exchange or out of the pool. So it would be a out of market settlement happening on the capacity charges, and there the real question pops up that just by having probably products that allow financial settlement, because as of now electricity as a commodity is non-transferable, intangible commodity, and it can only be physically settled. So with that in mind, do we see that long-term pricing view will emerge, and because that is necessary to deepen the market, as you said. And just to inform Sir that and there was a apprehension on the attributional demand or the aspirational demand or the latent demand not being mapped properly. So we are soon, actually we have commissioned to work with CEA to develop a methodology to map out the latent demand on a pan-India basis, which might be a data that can feed into the tracker.
Thank you.
You rightly said, in fact, that is how we are looking at the comparative between the capacity market and the energy market. So we don't want to stop at the energy market. Maybe there will be some kind of a mixed approach, hybrid kind of thing that we are trying to think. Because what we want also is not only the existing PPAs, but even the market should signal for the future capacity addition as well. So that's the future aim.
Sir, can I ask you a question? I mean,
So please introduce yourself.
okay. Good evening, everyone. I'm Nishit Srivastava. I work with a German development bank called KfW. Sir, during the discussions, you had mentioned that now hydro and pump storage will be the need of an hour, the way this renewable energy injection is coming in. but with the pace renewable energy injections are installed, and with the pace hydro and pump storages are installed, do you think are we going in a right track in terms of deciding, or are we late in the future prospects?
See, hydro per se in India is a very difficult ballgame. It's not as easy as renewables or even thermal or coal-based plants. When I take a decision, I get to it and I install and finish it. Hydro has, I mean, you must have seen in the last 7 to 8 years, I'll say, I mean, lot of factors, not one. I mean, it could be social factors, could be some of the NGOs who have been, or some of the environmentalist issues, lot of issues. But because of certain key measures that we have taken in the last 2 years, particularly the recent hydro policy, hydro guidelines which we have announced, and some of the hydro-rich states, particularly Himachal, Uttarakhand, J&K, and Arunachal. So all these 4 states politically are now aligned to get the development going, and that is how you must have seen Subansiri is likely to, I mean, we are likely to finish that kind of whatever the jinx were there in that. Even others, whatever is, I mean, which are the low-hanging fruits, we are able to take out. Even one of the project which went to NCLT has been taken by NHPC. So even we are roping in the PSUs that wherever there are opportunities, why not to rope in and get hydro going. So that's the kind of approach right now. Definitely it will be slow. It cannot be as fast as solar, which you can bring in 12 months the day you decide to bring it. But definitely we want hydros to come. Not only there, I mean here, but we are trying to tap the potentials in the neighboring country as well. 2 hydro projects in Nepal we are closely following. One of them is getting developed through SJVNL. The other one is the Upper Karnali project, which GMR is trying to finalize. Then in Bhutan, 5 projects are already in pipeline, which is likely to give us benefit. Mangdechu, which was recently inaugurated by PM when he visited Bhutan, that 720 megawatt Mangdechu project is already commissioned. There are, I think, 6-7 projects in the JVs, which Indian government and the Bhutanese government joint venture it is coming up. So because of the ease of development in the neighboring countries, we are also trying to see that why not to tap those hydro potential as well for us. So
I have one, I mean,
have already left.
last question, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a small comment actually. CRC
You
is
could
given.
introduce yourself.
Yes. So my name is Anil Mehta. I represent Secure Meters. So I am the principal public policy there. About the renewable integration and interest rate transmission, sir, I think we are still waiting for the CRC order to be clarified on the pooling station side, because that's the major issue. There is no model document or the procedure. How?
So Anil, that's a very technical, narrow question.
Right.
May
No,
not fit
I'm just
with-
talking about the transmission side, which Megnani sir has already. So I just wanted to make a comment that we have to work towards it so that we can make a better, transmission system and evacuation of the renewable, as you said.
Thank you. It's a good observation. Question in closing. So much of our discussion has been grid scale. In fact, the tracker, as we know, is limited to grid scale. But the original 175, 100 solar target is 60-40. 40 is rooftop, or so-called behind the meter. A, it's behind schedule relative to the other one. B, it has a lot of potential, but with other implications for the discoms and the downstream. Any thoughts on how that may or may not shift? How do we capture its data? How does it play into a market? Or is it all sort of a black box to the rest of the system because you don't control or even know about what others are doing? And has there been any thought or proclamation on, let's say the future target is 350, I'm making up a number, what an apportionment might be on the solar side between grid scale and rooftop? That's one thing that's not getting enough attention, but it may turn out to be very critical, or it may be the sort of weak link in this chain as well.
But after looking the risk increasing in my ground solar, certain focus shift is now in the solar rooftop is also more attention is being given now. Earlier it was thought a big 1000 megawatt capacity comes within 18 months, it is good. For collecting 1000 megawatt to solar rooftop, I have to make a lot of effort. But a lot of international agencies are helping now to give that more solar rooftop. And one technical issue like you have to, it is not become a black box. We are doing good experiment in Chandigarh, etc. That online data from these solar rooftop can be captured. But what is happening, inverters makers.
At what scale? I mean, even if it's a
If
very
it is a 1 kilowatt, then we will monitor that. But for that, we are facing a technical problem. All inverter makers have a different type of API to collect the data. So we are coming up with a proposal that a common API should be there for solar rooftop, which can be given to the DISCOM. In Delhi, for 3 locations, we are doing some experiment on the solar, some societies.
So one suggestion is orange button,
Yeah.
which is a counter of the green button standard for data for consumer side. There's also talk of there is an orange button standard for solar
Because
data.
in California, a lot of solar rooftop data is already being collected. We are lacking. After 2-3 months, we get the real picture of the solar rooftop. Now we will try to make it some online system. Some experiments are going on.
I think that highlights that this is a moving target. We have targets, but
But
this
in
space is
in RE data, I will assure you that the error of your error will come down every month. It is my assurance, because lot of data which we are collecting from the source, they were not understanding whether I am requiring a source level data or consumer level data. So there was a double accounting. So in each month we are removing some errors. So after 2-3 months, better data will be available.
and you'll see that in our tracker that the percentage is improving. So I think maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, Thomas. The short-term picture is not bad, it's more understood. It's after early mid-2020s by when we'll have to have some more hard decisions being made. So
Decision have to be made now.
Yeah.
yes, but that is the challenge of time constants. So I think this is an important field, not just for India's energy security, but
Have-
global
have you not
implications as well. I want to thank our panelists for a wonderful discussion and invite all of you to continue the conversation with refreshments outside. Thank you, everyone.